The grocery store was busy, the lines at the checkout growing longer as the afternoon rush set in. People stood with their carts full of fresh produce, canned goods, and everyday essentials, waiting impatiently for their turn. Among the cashiers, one stood out. Not because of her efficiency, but because of how slowly she moved. Her name was Emily. She was in her early 20s, her light brown hair tied back neatly, and her uniform slightly oversized on her small frame. Every time she scanned an item, she did it carefully, checking the price twice before placing it gently into the bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she handled fragile items like eggs and glass jars. The line at her register grew longer, and the frustration among the customers became more obvious. Some sighed loudly, tapping their feet, while others exchanged glances as if to say, "Why is she so slow?" Then a sharp voice cut through the low hum of chatter. "Oh, come on. Can you move any slower?" A middle-aged man in a suit threw his hands up in exasperation. His cart was filled with expensive items, imported wines, gourmet cheeses, and neatly packed vegetables. His expression was one of pure impatience. "I have places to be. Do they let just anyone work here these days?" A few others murmured in agreement, some nodding, while others simply watched, waiting to see how Emily would respond. But she didn't. She just kept scanning, her hands steady despite the obvious tension in the air. The manager, a woman in her 40s with neatly tied back hair, noticed the commotion and hurried over. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. "The problem is your cashier," the man snapped. "She's moving like she has all day, but I don't. You should put someone faster on this register." Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll do my best to hurry." But the man wasn't satisfied. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. If you can't handle a simple job like this, maybe you shouldn't be working here." Emily lowered her gaze, swallowing hard. The other customers continued watching, some nodding in silent agreement, others simply uncomfortable. The manager hesitated for a moment, looking at Emily, then back at the impatient man. And then, before she could respond, an unexpected voice from the back of the line spoke up. "She's not slow because she's lazy," the voice said. "There's a reason behind it." The crowd turned, curious. Emily froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. And in that moment, the truth was about to come out. The crowd turned toward the voice. It belonged to an elderly woman, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her eyes sharp and knowing. She stepped forward, her small frame barely noticeable among the taller customers. The man in the suit scoffed. "Oh yeah? And what reason would that be?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Because from where I'm standing, she's just wasting everyone's time." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she continued scanning. She didn't look up, but her face had gone pale. The elderly woman sighed, shaking her head. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said firmly. "But I do." She turned to Emily, her voice gentler now. "Sweetheart, does he know?" Emily bit her lip. The manager glanced at her, concerned, but Emily remained silent. The tension in the air grew thicker, the customers now more curious than annoyed. The elderly woman turned back to the impatient man. "This young lady has been through more than you can imagine," she said. "And she still comes here, working hard every single day, even when she doesn't have to." The man frowned. "What are you talking about?" The elderly woman sighed and looked directly at Emily. "Sweetheart, do you want me to tell them, or would you like to?" Emily hesitated, her fingers clenched around the edge of the counter. Then, after a long pause, she exhaled shakily. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard and looked up at the crowd. "I have a medical condition," she finally admitted. "A nerve disorder. It affects my hands." A hush fell over the customers. The man in the suit narrowed his eyes as if unsure whether to believe her. Emily continued, her voice steadier now. "Some days are better than others. Some days my hands don't shake as much and I can move faster. But today," she trailed off, glancing down at her fingers, which trembled slightly as she held the scanner. "Today isn't one of those days." The store fell silent. The manager's expression softened. A few customers exchanged guilty looks. The man in the suit shifted uncomfortably. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" he muttered. "You weren't," the elderly woman said, her voice calm but firm. "But maybe next time, instead of jumping to conclusions, you'll think before you speak." Emily looked down, her face unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, Relief, maybe, or something close to it. For the first time that day, she didn't feel invisible. A heavy silence filled the store. No one quite knew what to say. The man in the suit shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact, while other customers looked down at their carts, guilt settling in. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never wanted attention, never wanted anyone to pity her. That was why she had never told anyone at work about her condition, not even her manager. She just wanted to be treated like everyone else. The elderly woman placed a gentle hand on the counter. "You're incredibly strong, dear," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't push themselves the way you do." Emily forced a small smile, but before she could respond, another voice spoke up. "I'm sorry," a younger woman in line muttered. She had been one of the customers sighing earlier, impatiently shifting her weight from foot to foot. Now she looked ashamed. "I didn't know." The murmurs started then, small at first but growing as more customers whispered to each other. Some nodded, some looked down, and some even glanced at Emily with a new kind of respect. The manager cleared her throat, stepping forward. "Emily," she said, her voice softer now. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily hesitated. "I didn't want special treatment," she admitted. "I just wanted to do my job like everyone else." The manager nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I get that," she said. "But you don't have to struggle alone. We could have made adjustments, found a way to make things easier for you." Emily looked down. The thought of asking for help had always felt like admitting weakness. But standing there, with so many eyes on her, some filled with guilt, others with admiration, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything by herself. Then, to everyone's surprise, the man in the suit sighed loudly. "Look, He ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I was out of line." Emily blinked, stunned. He cleared his throat and glanced around as if making sure no one was recording him. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I had a long day and I took it out on you." He exhaled sharply. "I'm sorry." Emily didn't know what to say. A few customers nodded in approval, and the tension in the air finally started to ease. The elderly woman smiled knowingly. "Well," she said, looking at the long line still waiting. "Maybe we can all be a little more patient from now on, There were murmurs of agreement, and slowly, the customers began to settle down. Emily felt her hands tremble slightly as she reached for the next item, but this time, she wasn't afraid of what people would think, because for the first time, they truly saw her. The atmosphere in the store had shifted. Where there had once been impatience and frustration, there was now quiet understanding. The line moved forward, but no one complained anymore. Emily continued scanning, her movements still careful, but now, there was no rush, no heavy judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The man in the suit, now unusually quiet, stepped forward as Emily reached the last few items in his cart. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. I actually don't need this," he muttered, setting down an expensive bottle of wine. Emily scanned the last few items, her movements still slow but steady. The beeping of the scanner filled the silence between them, the impatience that had once been thick in the air, now replaced by something else, something unspoken. When she finally tore the receipt from the register and extended it toward the man, he hesitated. For a brief moment, his fingers hovered over the paper, as if he were deciding whether to just take it and leave, or do something more. Then, with a sharp exhale, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and placed it gently on the counter. "For you?" he muttered quickly, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier harshness. Before Emily could react, he grabbed his bags and strode away, his pace brisk as though he wanted to escape before anyone could say anything else. Emily blinked, her breath hitching slightly as she stared at the bill in front of her. Her fingers twitched, hesitant to pick it up, as if doing so would make the moment real. It wasn't just the money, it was what it meant. The elderly woman, still standing nearby, let out a soft chuckle, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Seems like you taught him a lesson today," she mused, her voice carrying the kind of wisdom that only comes with age. Emily shook her head slowly, still processing what had just happened. "I didn't do anything," she murmured, almost as if trying to convince herself. The elderly woman smiled knowingly, her gaze filled with something deeper than simple kindness. "Oh, sweetheart, she said softly. You did more than you think. Emily's chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. She had spent so much of her life believing that she had to shrink herself, to push through silently, to never expect kindness from the world. And yet, here she was, having changed something, even if just for a moment. From the side, the manager, who had been quietly observing, finally stepped forward. Emily, she said gently, her tone different now. Not just professional, but understanding. Why don't you take a short break? I'll cover your register. Emily hesitated, instinctively wanting to protest. She had always felt like she needed to prove herself, to work harder just to be seen as enough. But now, for the first time, she realized she didn't have to. She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little, and nodded. Okay. As Emily stepped away from the register, she let out a slow, shaky breath, one she hadn't even realized she had been holding. It felt like releasing a weight that had been pressing down on her chest all day, maybe even longer. Her fingers, still slightly trembling, loosened their grip on the counter as she took her first real step away, leaving behind the stares, the judgments, and the quiet struggle she had carried for so long. The break room was only a few steps away, but each one felt like a quiet victory. For so long, she had moved through her days feeling invisible, as if she were nothing more than a machine meant to scan items and keep the line moving. No one had ever truly seen her, not beyond the surface, not beyond her slow hands and cautious movements. But today, something had shifted. Today, people had seen her. Not as an inconvenience, not as someone who didn't belong, but as a person, one who was doing her best despite the obstacles she faced. They had heard her, understood her, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to apologize for simply existing. And that, in itself, was enough. As she reached the break room door, she hesitated for a brief second, her hand hovering over the handle. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed it open. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights greeted her, along with the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. She stepped inside, feeling a warmth in her chest that hadn't been there before. Tomorrow would bring another day. More lines, more impatient customers, more moments where she would have to steady her shaking hands and push through. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it, because today had shown her something she hadn't realized before. She wasn't alone. A small, grateful smile touched her lips as she sat down, her body finally relaxing. No, she wouldn't face tomorrow alone, and that was enough. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. How did this moment make you feel? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe for more powerful and emotional stories. Your support helps us bring more meaningful content to you. Let's spread kindness and understanding together. Subscribe, like, comment, share.